Hello, my name is Isolde Driscoll, and you're very welcome to the Hugh Lane Gallery's series of online talks. Today, as part of our coffee conversation series, I'll be discussing this work called Embroidery by Sir James Jebusa Shannon. He was active at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries in both London and New York, and he was best known as a society portraitist. It's also part of the Hugh Lane Legacy exhibition that's currently on show in the gallery. Now, I'll just minimize my video panel so as not to distract you from the paintings, and then we'll begin. Okay. Now, before discussing this particular painting, I first want to tell you about James Shannon himself and his work in general, and give you some background to its being included in the Municipal Gallery collection when the gallery opened in 1908. Now here's a photograph of him at work on the left around 1898 when he was in his late 30s, along with a portrait from about 1910 in quite grand academic style by the American artist Orlando Ruland. Now, like many other artists, Shannon was in his day very famous and highly thought of, but due to a combination of circumstances and changes in taste, he has since fallen into relative obscurity. He was best known as a society portraitist. He painted members of the aristocracy and wealthy landed gentry in England, as well as the families of the great magnates of the so-called American Gilded Age. Shannon is slightly unusual in that at various times he's been claimed by the artistic schools of 3 different countries. He trained in London and lived there for all his working life. So in England, he was generally regarded as a painter of the British school. However, he'd been born in the United States, so American patrons and commentators tended to claim him as an American artist. And when Hugh Lane was organising his exhibition in London in 1904 to promote the work of specifically Irish artists, he included Shannon's paintings on the basis that his parents were Irish. Now I'll give you some biographical details. James Jebusa Shannon was born in Auburn, a rural town in New York, in 1862. He was one of 7 children, and his parents had emigrated from Ireland shortly after they were married. They settled in the United States, where his father was a railway contractor. And there was a family story about how Shannon got his middle name. Apparently, just before he was born, his mother was travelling in a carriage when the horse bolted. She was rescued by a man who was said to be the chief of a local Indian tribe, who was called Jebusa. And she felt that he had saved her life, so when James was born the following day, she gave him the name Jebusa in honour of their rescuer. In the 1870s, the family moved to Ontario in Canada, and it's here that Shannon developed his passion for painting. His father allowed him to take lessons from a local artist who thought that he showed talent. So in 1878, when he was 16, Shannon was sent to London to study. He attended the South Kensington School of Art, which is now the Royal College of Art, and he studied under Edward Poynter, who was a well-known painter who went on later to become president of the Royal Academy. Now, Shannon did very well at the South Kensington School, and he won several prizes, including gold medals for drawing and figure painting. And in 1880, when he was just 18, he was commissioned by Queen Victoria to paint portraits of her ladies in waiting, probably on Poynter's recommendation. These works were Mrs. Henry Burke and this one, Lady Horatia Stopford. This is actually Shannon's first public commission, and as you can see, it's quite a conservative work in the formal, fairly academic tradition. I think it's actually quite a gloomy portrait. The sitter is dressed in black as she's officially in mourning. Now, you might have heard about Queen Victoria and her ladies in waiting. They went into mourning when her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861. And they remained in mourning for him until she died 40 years later in 1901. So this explains the mourning dress. At the Queen's request, these two works were exhibited at the Royal Academy shows in 1880 and 1881, where they were greatly admired. Now, this may have been in part because of their very elevated patron. And these high status commissions helped to launch Shannon's career. When he first came to London, Shannon had intended to return home once he'd finished training. But because of his initial success, he decided to stay on. He began to receive further work, particularly from members of the English establishment, who were obviously happy to follow the Queen's recommendation in selecting a portrait painter. And he quickly gained a reputation as a society portraitist. Now, Shannon owed his early success, at least in part, to the promotion of his work in the conservative surroundings of the Royal Academy. However, like many of his fellow artists of the time, he was also influenced by new ideas that were coming into Britain from abroad, particularly from France. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, there was quite a bit of unrest in the British art world. In particular, there was a standoff between those who, on the one hand, who supported what they saw as sound, well-tried academic traditions, and others, who were generally younger artists, who called for innovation and new practices. Traditionally, British art institutions had been viewed as quite inward-looking and insular. And for instance, in the middle of the century, the pre-Raphaelite school of painters had challenged what they called the dishonest shallowness of the Royal Academy, which they saw as representing the art establishment. Now, in time, the pre-Raphaelites joined the establishment themselves, but they were in turn overtaken by a later generation of painters wanting to do something new. And particularly influential in this group were those artists who had lived and studied in France and been exposed to new ideas, such as plein air naturalism and impressionism. In 1881, his father's money troubles meant that Shannon had to abandon his formal training. So he left the South Kensington School and went to live in an artist's colony on Manresa Road in Chelsea, where he began painting. Now, here he came into close contact with members of the artistic avant-garde. And many of them, such as George Clausen, for example, whose work is in the Hugh Lane Gallery, they had trained and worked in France and picked up new ideas, which they were intent on introducing to the British public. Shannon aligned himself with this new generation of French-taught painters. He was a founder member of the New English Arts Club, or as it became to be known, the NEAC. The NEAC was set up in 1886 with the aim of challenging the Royal Academy's monopoly over the art market. They thought that the Academy was commercialised and reactionary, and as they put it themselves, in the hands of old men. Instead, the NEAC intended to be progressive, to promote new ideas, and to provide an alternative exhibition space for more experimental and innovative art. So they were similar to the pre-Raphaelite painters at the middle of the century in attacking the Royal Academy. Over the course of the 1880s and 1890s, Shannon absorbed many of the new ideas being promoted by the NEAC and incorporated them into his work. For example, this painting called Estelle, which you can see here. Now, the sitter's identity is unknown, but she bears some resemblance to the famous actress Sarah Bernhardt, whose image would have been very familiar at the time from posters and publicity photographs. This is a very radical work for the period. It's a striking image of a glamorous new woman with her fashionable clothes and hairstyle. And you can see that she's quite uninhibited and she looks out boldly, directly engaging with the viewer. And I don't know if you can see them, the vertical inscriptions down either side of the canvas, they're also quite innovative. And you'll find these in other paintings by Shannon. The broad square brushstrokes, for example, on the big bow at her neck, and the muted grey and white colour tones suggest modern French painting techniques and also the influence of Whistler. Now, Whistler was a leading exponent of aestheticism, and aestheticism held that a painting's purpose was to be first and foremost a thing of a thing of beauty. That's a beautiful arrangement of lines and colours and a pleasure to the eye, rather than simply having the purpose of carrying a particular extraneous meaning, such as an illustration of a story or a poem. Now, Whistler's paintings were notable for their beautiful and harmonious colour tones, and these were often quite muted or monochrome. However, despite all this, you can see that Estelle's face is highly finished and carefully and clearly painted. Shannon never completely abandoned his formal academic training. In fact, he's noticeable for his ability to produce work incorporating both conservative and innovative elements. The British market for portraits was very competitive at this time, with many artists vying for the most prestigious commissions. So in order to stand out, Shannon needed to differentiate his style and find his own niche. He was conscious of changing aesthetic tastes, so he incorporated new techniques such as broken brushwork and tonal colour schemes into his work. But he also felt that he had to ensure that it kept the clarity and elegance associated with grand aristocratic works by old masters like Van Dyck and Thomas Lawrence, as these were greatly admired by his society patrons. Now, a good example of the way Shannon managed to bridge the gap between traditional and modern is this self-portrait of 1884 on the left. It emulates an earlier 18th century painting by Joshua Reynolds that you can see beside it, another self-portrait. But at the same time, its broad, impressionistic brushwork and colour arrangements differentiate it from the earlier work and make it appear modern. Following on from his 1880 commissions for Queen Victoria, Shannon's next big break came at the end of the 1880s, when he came into contact with Lady Violet Manners. She was a member of the aristocracy, the Marchioness of Granby, and she later became Duchess of Rutland. And as a result of her patronage, Shannon became more or less court painter to the Dukes of Rutland. He received commissions to produce portraits of many members of the family, particularly Violet Manners herself and her 3 daughters. He painted them several times, both formally and informally. And here are some of these works. On top are 2 formal portraits of Violet and her eldest daughter Marjorie, painted in the 1890s in the grand manner of the old masters. You can see them there. And below are 2 later portraits of the same sitters from the early 20th century. And you can see in completely different, more modern and less conventional styles. I think that these paintings demonstrate the range of Shannon's artistic ability and his capacity to evolve and change his painting style over time. By virtue of his connections with both the artistic establishment and more avant-garde painters, Shannon was at first able to keep a foot in both camps. He exhibited his more formal conservative portraits at the Royal Academy, while he reserved his innovative, less conventional paintings for spaces like the NEAC and the progressive Grosvenor Gallery. Gradually, however, As he became more and more successful as a portrait painter, he was obliged to make a choice. He eventually stopped exhibiting at the NEAC after a very bad review of his work in 1892, when George Moore disparaged him as a painter of what he called white satin duchesses. And more, he confined his public work to the Royal Academy, and only in private did he experiment with other styles. Shannon specialised in portraits of women, and these became very prized, as they were thought to be particularly flattering to his female sitters. And at the turn of the century, he was second in status as a society portraitist only to John Singer Sargent, another American artist who was the preeminent one. As a result, Shannon was able to acquire a house and studio in Holland Park, where he received his establishment patrons in some luxury. Shannon met his future wife, Florence Cartwright, in 1884, when she was apparently a student at the Royal Kensington School of Needlework. Their daughter, Kitty, was born in 1887, though it seems that they didn't actually marry until 1890. Now, this evidence of their early bohemian lifestyle was suppressed later on when he became a well-known establishment painter. Shannon's wife and daughter were a very important source of inspiration for him, and he painted many pictures of them, often in more experimental style. For example, this one of Kitty in court dress. And in later life, she would go on to become a painter and illustrator herself. In 1892, Shannon paid his first visit to America, since leaving there over 15 years earlier. His work was introduced to American audiences when it appeared as part of the British exhibition at the Chicago World Fair. And once the American press realized that he had actually been born in New York, they immediately laid claim to him. As a result, the United States became an important source of work for Shannon. He made 3 lengthy visits there, starting in 1904, and he received over 35 commissions for portraits from wealthy American clients. The period from 1880 to the start of the First World War became known in the United States as the Gilded Age, and it saw huge social and economic changes in the country. Rapid industrialization was facilitated by a large influx of foreign labor, and this produced vast personal fortunes for individuals such as the steel magnates Andrew Carnegie and Nelson Rockefeller. And these immensely rich industrialists became powerful and influential public figures. These new American millionaires were anxious to show off their wealth and status. They made annual visits to Europe and became acquainted with its history and culture, visiting its museums and art galleries where they saw fine examples of European art. They began to copy the European aristocracy, whose houses and art collections impressed them with their elegance and refinement and grandeur. And this, in turn, had an impact on the American art market, which saw a growing demand for fine, full-length portraits in the manner of 17th and 18th century court painters like Anthony van Dyck and Joshua Reynolds. Shannon was particularly sought after in these circumstances. In the first place, potential American clients would probably have seen his work on their visits to the Royal Academy shows in London, as these were often social occasions for foreign visitors. Also, he was still an American citizen at this time, so they could get a portrait from an internationally acclaimed high-status artist, while at the same time being able to patronize an American painter. Shannon's visits to the United States were very successful for him professionally. He painted commissions for many wealthy and powerful clients, such as this one of Nora McMullen, the wife of the financier Andrew Mellon. You can see it's a life-size, full-length portrait in the manner of Thomas Lawrence, who was an 18th century painter of the British landed gentry. She's presented in quite a classical pose, in aristocratic court dress, and with an antique fountain in the background. She almost looks like a member of a European royal family, and this is exactly the effect that Shannon's rich clients were probably seeking. These visits to America also made him very wealthy. For example, in 1907, he was able to ask $7,500 from an American client for a full-length portrait. And this was an almost unheard of price for the time, equivalent to over $200,000 at today's values. Now, as time went on, Shannon became more and more associated with conservative academic painting. From 1910 onwards, he exhibited exclusively with the Royal Academy and was no longer publicly associated with avant-garde circles. His clientele came almost wholly from the higher levels of society, and he was increasingly seen as a member of the British establishment. Despite this, however, and especially when he wasn't tied down by the requirements of his portrait commissions, his work demonstrates that he continued to explore new ideas. For example, this painting from 1896. It's called A Sketch on the River, and it refers to a family boating holiday that Shannon and his wife and daughters made. It calls to mind Whistler, with its spare, minimal lines and pale colour scheme of pinks and browns and the splash of warm red on the right. It almost feels like an abstract painting, and it appears very modern compared with some of his other work. And this painting, also from 1896, called Spot Red, is, I think, even more striking. It depicts a woman holding a billiard ball and cue, and its monochrome colour arrangement of pale greys and whites suggests the influence of Whistler. But the figure is a real woman, and her pose, particularly the way she holds the red billiard ball, calls to mind Eve offering the apple in the Garden of Eden, and maybe suggesting some kind of sexual intrigue or temptation. It might refer to a popular short story of the period by Henry James called What Maisie Knew. This featured a character called Ida, who was a billiard player and was also inclined to engage in romantic intrigue. Now, it's thought that the sitter may be Shannon's sister-in-law, Liz Cartwright, who lived with them for a while. And some people have speculated that there might be some additional personal hidden meaning in the picture, but unfortunately we can't tell at this time. As well as pale colour arrangements in the style of Whistler, Shannon was also interested in the texture of paint itself and its artistic possibilities. And this brings us on to the painting that we're looking at today, Embroidery, which you can see here. But first, I'll give you some background on how it came into the Hugh Lane connection. Shannon's first involvement with Hugh Lane's project to promote art in Ireland came about in 1904, when he received a request for paintings for an exhibition of work by Irish artists that Lane was organising in London. Lane wanted to promote Irish art abroad, but his initial plan for a separate Irish section at the World Fair in St. Louis had fallen through. So he decided to mount an exhibition in London instead. Lane felt that Shannon's Irish parents qualified him for inclusion, even though up to now he had been known exclusively as an Anglo-American painter. Shannon provided 5 works for the exhibition at the Guildhall, which turned out to be a great success with large attendances and positive press reviews. Lane then called for artists to donate examples of their work to a collection that he was putting together for a municipal gallery to be established in Dublin. So in 1907, Shannon painted this picture and presented it to the collection. And while the majority of Shannon's work is made up of portraits, he also painted more general, what were known as genre scenes, or blends of the two, like this one. And in Victorian Britain, it had been quite popular to combine portraiture with other genres to produce something ambiguous and open to different interpretations, and maybe provoke a talking point. Several of Shannon's works follow this pattern. For example, the spot red that I showed you above. Since embroidery was not a commissioned work, Shannon was also able to follow his own artistic inclinations in painting it, and I think it presents a good reflection of these interests. The sitter is unknown, but bears a resemblance to Shannon's wife Florence. She had studied at the South Kensington School of Needlework, so the embroidery theme might be a reference to that. This is actually quite a fanciful work, I think. It shows a young woman engaged in embroidery in a closed, dark interior, while a small green bird perches on her shoulder. The effect is rich and luxurious and slightly exotic. And the presence of the bird in particular adds interest. Shannon liked to experiment with patterns and textures, and you can see this here. He uses thick, heavy strokes of paint to emphasize the texture of the curtains and the arrangement behind the seated woman. And they shimmer and make the surface appear almost three-dimensional. Elsewhere, the paint's been vigorously applied in varied brushstrokes. And these evoke the different textures of the various surfaces. For example, the woman's muslin dress, the pearls at her neck, and the piece of embroidery on her lap. And the colours are rich and vibrant. The shimmering green of the bird's plumage provides a contrast with the red of the woman's hair and cheeks, and the piece of multicoloured embroidery. At the same time, the pink and white flowers on her dress echo the floral pattern of the fabric that she's working on. And the overall effect is one of a rich, luxurious, textured patterned surface. And the thickly applied paint makes it appear almost tangible. The overall mood of the painting is one of intimacy, and that gives the viewer the sense of looking in on a private scene. The sitter is thoughtful and serene, and she's absorbed in her sewing, closed off from the outer world in a dark, warmly lit, closed space. Shannon creates a similar effect with this work from around the same time, called Contemplation, and it's said to depict his daughter Kitty. As you can see, it has the same dark, rich, patterned surfaces and deep colours, and along with the sitter absorbed in her own thoughts. So these two works suggest that these were his artistic concerns at the time. Shannon's high status as a society portrait painter meant that for a time he was seen as John Singer Sargent's most serious rival in Britain. However, when Sargent finally tired of portrait painting after about 1907, it was in fact the London-based Hungarian painter Philip de Laszlo who inherited his clients, rather than Shannon. This may have been because of the amount of time Shannon was spending in the United States, or maybe because he had less time for commissions, as he now took up various positions in the public art world. For example, in 1910, he became president of the Society of Portrait Painters. But for whatever reason, when Sargent retired, de Laszlo became the preeminent society portrait painter and not Shannon. Interestingly, the Hugh Lane collection has examples of portraits by both Sargent and de Laszlo, which you can see here. Lane was a huge admirer of Sargent, and as well as the sketch of Lady Beresford that you can see on the left, He had also received his own portrait, which his friends commissioned from the artist. Elaine bequeaths both of these to the collection. The de Laszlo work on the right is a portrait of his wife Lucy, who presented it to the gallery in 1939. She was a member of the Guinness family, and this portrait is now on loan to Farmley, the Guinness family home, where it hangs. Despite de Laszlo's ascent, Shannon continued to enjoy success up until the outbreak of the First World War, when the flow of portrait commissions started to dry up, particularly from America. In the same year, he was seriously injured in a fall from a horse, which eventually paralyzed him and confined him to a wheelchair. As a result, he largely abandoned formal full-length portrait commissions, as he no longer had the stamina for them. And instead, he concentrated on smaller scale, more intimate works, a bit like the two later portraits of Violet Manners and her daughter that I showed you earlier. As a result, his style became freer and he indulged in artistic experiments. And a very late example of his work is this one on the left, from about 1921, called The Tea Party. It's a small, intimate genre painting, and it's definitely a work of leisure rather than a commission. Shannon had for a long time been inclined to experiment with new ideas in his more private paintings. And this work suggests that he was thinking of post-impressionist painters, such as Cézanne. These would have been unknown in Britain since 1910, when Roger Fry mounted a groundbreaking exhibition of post-impressionist work in London. It's been freely painted with loose, visible brushstrokes for the sky in the background and patches of colour for the vegetation. At the same time, the composition, particularly the position of the picnic group in the foreground, suggests Claude Monet's impressionist work, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which you can see beside it, or even Manet's original Déjeuner sur l'herbe. It's almost as though, finally free from the constraints of his formal commissions, Shannon was able to fully indulge an interest in modern French artistic ideas. The bright blues and greens and yellows of the landscape and the pink and white of the women's clothes and the tablecloth suggest a sunny day of leisure in the countryside. And the whole thing evokes a feeling of well-being in the summer sun. This seems to me to be quite a joyous work, and you get the impression that Shannon probably enjoyed painting it, indulging in his interest in pattern and colour. Shannon became a British citizen in 1922 when he was awarded a knighthood, and he died the following year, aged 61. So there you have the story of James Jebusa Shannon. For a time, at the beginning of the 20th century, he was a celebrated portrait painter, but since then has unfortunately largely fallen from notice. I hope you enjoyed hearing about him, as well as about this interesting example of his work. It's on show in the gallery at the moment, so I hope you come in person and see what you think, because I think that the best way of appreciating a portrait is to actually see it for yourself. Thank you very much and goodbye.